We've been hearing a lot of talk over the past couple of years about collapse, and I wanted to ask you right off the bat, is collapse of the U.S. dollar, imminent collapse, is it inevitable?
It is mathematically inevitable, but when it does collapse, it won't be because it reaches a certain threshold. All monetary collapses, and they happen all the time with every single fiat currency, the average one lasting over about 42 years. They all happen because it's a psychological event. It gets to a point where the people who are in charge of printing the money print so much of it that those that are accepting it start to realize it has no value. And we came very close to it in 2008.
On Thursday at about 11 o'clock in the morning, the Federal Reserve noticed a tremendous drawdown of money market accounts in the United States to the tune of $550 billion was being drawn out in a matter of an hour or two. The Treasury opened up its window to help. They pumped $105 billion in the system and quickly realized that they could not stem the tide. We were having an electronic run on the banks. They decided to close the operation, close down the money accounts, and announce a guarantee of $250,000 per account so there wouldn't be further panic out there. And that's what actually happened. If they had not done that, their estimation was that by 2 o'clock that afternoon, $5.5 trillion would have been drawn out of the money market system of the United States, would have collapsed the entire economy of the United States, and within 24 hours, the world economy would have collapsed.
2008 was really an institutional crisis with AIG and Lehman Brothers and General Motors. And all those bad debts, all those problems that we had, all got sopped up by the sovereign nations and ultimately passed on to the taxpayers, but more realistically onto the actual dollars that we use. And since they continue to print more dollars to sustain these bad debts and pay off those who are connected, at some point, whenever the next crisis happens, and I'm thinking it's going to happen sooner or later, that it's going to be a huge, what I call the single largest event in human history. And, our entire way of life is dependent upon the constant expansion of debt and credit, and our whole world is dependent on it.
We're talking with Chris Duane about this imminent collapse of the U.S. dollar. You talk about a fiat currency, and I want people who are just getting their toes in the water on this subject to understand what you mean by that.
Well, fiat really just means by decree. It has value because there's government legal tender laws that force people to take it. That in itself is something that people should really ponder. If it wasn't forced upon you, would you really accept promises of wealth, or would you actually accept real wealth? And this is going back many years, but our money used to have gold and silver physically behind it. In fact, the paper notes that circulated were redeemable in gold and silver coin. And, over time, the bankers got very wise and said, well, maybe we don't need to actually give around this gold and silver. We'll just keep passing these paper notes around. And then they got into cahoots with the government, and the government said, well, we'll just force it by decree, and that's where fiat comes from.
How did the government get away with that? It was interesting to me that Richard Nixon basically, outlawed gold, and people at one point in this country were not even allowed to possess the substance. That seems downright un-American, but also very strange.
Well, it's not really how the government got away with it. Again, behind all these things, there's very private and powerful, wealthy bankers. Mm-hmm. Most people don't know that the Federal Reserve is not a government agency. There are no reserves, and it's not federal. A privately held central bank held by very wealthy families, namely the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers, who are these incredibly wealthy trillionaires out there. And they have, throughout the hundreds of years, the Federal Reserve is going to celebrate its 100th birthday this December. They have manipulated politicians and all of humanity to supporting this debt-based paradigm. And the United States government actually has to go, every dollar that comes into existence, the United States doesn't print it through the Treasury. The Treasury has to issue a bond and sell it to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve then credits the Treasury those dollars that are in there. And the trick is, the man-trick mechanism that they call it, is that they just create money out of thin air. But all the money that's created out of thin air is backed by a debt. And each debt has to pay back that debt plus interest. Well, if all the money comes into existence like that, the only way this system works is that more debt needs to be expanded every year in excess of the debt and interest accrued the year before. That's why if you look at the total amount of debt all over the world, it's constantly growing, and we are reaching a maximum point where the level of growth will exceed the ability for the economy to absorb it, and that will lead to a hyperinflationary collapse.